The timeout procedure is one of the most widely recognized tools in behavior management. But here's the thing. Just because you're using timeout does not mean that you're using it effectively. Without the right setup, reinforcement strategies, and follow through, timeout might not reduce the problem behavior at all. And in some cases, it might even make that problem behavior worse. So today we're going to take a look at what you need to know in order to use timeout effectively. Because I am Dr. Igor Yurichevich, and this is behavior modification. Let's go. All right, so today we're going to take a look at timeout from positive reinforcement, or as it's more commonly known, timeout. So remember that timeout is a form of negative punishment where a response is followed immediately by the removal of a stimulus, and then that decreases future occurrences of similar responses. So for our working definition today for timeout, we are actually going to go to the International Journal of Special Education and a study by Wolf, McLaughlin, and Williams. And their definition of timeout is that timeout is a complicated and intricate intervention involving far more than simply withdrawing an individual from ongoing activities and then returning him or her after a predetermined period of time. So timeout is a complicated and intricate intervention involving far more than simply what the definition of timeout is. And that next sentence mentions that effective timeout procedures are likely to vary a great deal. So today we're going to see at how exactly do you get those effective timeout procedures? How do you make sure that the timeout procedure that you're implementing is actually as effective as it could possibly be? So if you need a brief overview of negative punishment, just in general, so you can check out this video right here. What is positive, negative reinforcement versus punishment? And that'll give you a brief overview of the four different types, those four different basic types of contingencies, of which negative punishment is one. And then if you also need a deeper dive into it as well, you can check out this video right here, which covers mostly negative reinforcement, but also focuses on negative punishment as well. So before looking at how to use timeout effectively, let's first take a look at whether or not we should use it to begin with. So when should we resort to using a timeout procedure? Well, accepted practices want you to start with less intrusive methods. So it's actually better not to use timeout as your first step in a behavior modification program. Usually you want to start with less intrusive methods, such as differential reinforcement procedures, extinction procedures, and then you use timeout only if the evidence shows that those other strategies are failing. So for an example, a student who throws a tantrum during music class, you don't resort immediately to a timeout procedure for this student. First thing you want to do is maybe implement a differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors where they are taught to ask for help and they are reinforced for asking for help, while throwing the music on the floor results in an extinction. They don't get to avoid practice just because they threw their sheets on the floor. So you want to implement that differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors procedure. And then if that is ineffective, only when that intervention fails and maybe other interventions might fail, then you want to use the timeout procedure where the child is maybe placed into a timeout situation, removed to a corner of the room in order to reduce the throwing the music tantrum behavior. So first off, we want to make sure that we're not immediately jumping to a timeout procedure. So the first step in using timeout effectively is to actually use other things before you use timeout. But what if we do have to resort to using timeout? What if we do finally make the decision that, okay, we're going to try timeout, nothing else has worked, let's go to a timeout procedure? Well, the first way that you can make sure that your timeout is effective is to actually make sure that you enrich the time in environment. So the time in environment has to be positively reinforcing. And you want to reinforce in that time in environment behaviors that are incompatible with the problem behavior. You want to make sure in that time in environment, you use a high ratio of positive feedback to corrective feedback. So a lot of positive reinforcement versus the negative punishment of the timeout procedure. And very importantly, when a learner is coming back from the timeout environment, make sure that you reinforce the appropriate target good behavior immediately after that timeout ends. As soon as you possibly can, when that timeout procedure ends, make sure that the incompatible behaviors with that problem behavior are reinforced as soon as you can. So for example, let's say that a teacher, she provides praise and points for cooperative play and timeout for shouting. We have the situation where the time in setting is positively reinforcing. So that teacher is giving praise and she's giving points. So those are reinforcing. Also, cooperative play on its own can be naturally reinforcing. It's just fun to play with others. So in this case, you have a timeout setting that is positively reinforcing. The reinforced behaviors are incompatible with the problem behavior. So the problem behavior is shouting. The reinforced behavior is cooperative play. And cooperative play is usually incompatible with shouting. So in this case, we have that other feature where the reinforced behavior, cooperative play, is incompatible with the problem behavior of shouting. You would want to use a high ratio of +2 corrective feedback. So more praise from the teacher, more points from the teacher than people being put into the timeout situation. And then finally, you want to reinforce the appropriate behavior immediately after the timeout ends. So if a child is sent to a timeout situation, once that child rejoins the group, you want to reinforce that cooperative play immediately. You want to reinforce with praise. Wow, way to, rejoin the group. Way to cooperatively play. Maybe not that transparent, but way to cooperatively play with everybody else. Here's some points for coming back to the group and playing nicely with everybody else. You want to do that immediately after the timeout ends. All right, next step to make the timeout procedure very effective, you want to make sure that you define the behavior that leads to the timeout contingency. So you want to use explicit, observable, measurable definitions and give clear examples and non-examples of what behavior is going to result in being sent to the timeout environment. So for example, if you're a professor and you are going to use the timeout procedure to discourage cheating on an exam, instead of saying you're not allowed to cheat or no cheating or be respectful during the test, those aren't explicit, they're not observable, they're not measurable definitions. You would want to say something instead, such as during the exam, the following behaviors will result in a timeout. Looking at another student's paper, using a cell phone or a smartwatch, talking to another student, leaving your seat without permission. These are all very explicitly defined. They're very observable. You can observe when somebody leaves their seat without permission, and they're measurable. You can measure whether somebody is on their cell phone or not. So you want to define the behaviors that lead to the timeout in order to make the timeout procedure maximally effective. Next step, you want to choose the appropriate form of timeout. So we want to prioritize non-exclusion methods of timeout where the learner stays in the environment over exclusion versions of timeout where the learner is removed from the environment. And in this case, you also have to consider logistical constraints, things like school policy, work policies, university policies. You need to consider the individual needs. So for example, you might want to move a person with a problem behavior to a separate room, but it might just be that no separate room is available. It might be that in a particular school, we just don't have access to a separate room, or we don't have access to somebody who can monitor the student while they're in the separate room, and you can't leave children alone in a separate room. So in that case, you would want to choose, instead of the timeout procedure where they are removed from the environment, you would want to use something where they stay in the environment, such as planned ignoring or a partitioned timeout where they get sent to the corner instead of exclusion. And then also, just in general, you would want to prioritize non-exclusion methods wherever possible. They just tend to be more accepted and easier to implement. All right, the next step to make it highly effective, you want to obtain permission and communicate the timeout plan. So this is basically another logistics issue where you need to get administrative approval ahead of time when you're doing a timeout procedure in places that have rules, have policies. Make sure that you clear all those hurdles ahead of time. So decide in advance the type of timeout that you'll be using. Is it exclusion or is it non-exclusion? Determine the duration. Is it going to be for 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes? Determine the exit criteria. And then importantly, communicate that with the administration in whatever place you're implementing the timeout. Communicate it with colleagues who are going to help you implement that timeout procedure. Communicate it with caregivers that you will hand off that timeout procedure to. Make sure that you communicate the plan and that you get those permissions. All right, next, you want to make sure that you have timeout rules, as we just discussed, but then post and teach those timeout rules. So clearly post and clearly teach the behaviors that lead to timeout. Clearly teach the timeout duration that can be expected. Clearly teach what happens if misbehavior continues during a timeout. So for example, if you're trying to reduce the problem behavior of yelling, you can say yelling is going to result in a 3-minute contingent observation timeout. That is, you can observe, but you can't participate. And the timeout starts when you're sitting quietly and you can rejoin when calm. So here we have the behavior that leads to the timeout, which is the yelling. Timeout duration, 3 minutes of timeout. It's going to be contingent observation. What happens when the behavior continues to occur during timeout? Timeout starts when you are sitting quietly, and then you can rejoin when you're calm. So we taught those rules. That's going to make this timeout procedure much more effective. All right, next, keep the timeout duration short and effective. So this one might seem a little bit counterintuitive, but longer timeout periods are not necessarily better. You want your timeout periods to be as short as possible while maintaining effectiveness. And in research, typically this range is found to be between 2 to 5 minutes. So actually a pretty short duration to change that problem behavior. You want to avoid really long timeout procedures, so avoid exceeding 15 minutes, because the longer your timeout procedure is, the more likely you are to run into problems such as tolerance development. The learner with the problem behavior might just learn to enjoy and tolerate the timeout procedure. Loss of instructional time. Remember, you're removing those reinforcers. So while they can't earn those reinforcers, that means they can't learn any of those positive behaviors that we're hoping that they'll adopt. And then also they might have, the longer they wait, they can have access to bootleg reinforcement, such as self-stimulation. So they might just start learning how to, hum a tune. They might start daydreaming in their mind. It loses its effectiveness the longer they're able to find out ways to kind of circumvent that timeout procedure. So keep the duration short and effective, as short as possible while maintaining that effectiveness. Next way to make it effective, apply the timeout consistently. So much like in many other forms of punishment, every instance of the target behavior has to result in a timeout. If you want it to be maximally effective, every single time the target behavior occurs, the timeout environment is implemented. Inconsistency in this will weaken the behavior change. It'll cause confusion in the learner. It'll make it less effective. So the same way that dominoes only work if every single one falls, timeout works best if every single target behavior results in a timeout. Next way to make it effective, you want to make sure that you establish the exit criteria, aka how do you time in out of a timeout. So you want to choose from one of the following. So there's 3 basic ways to do an exit criteria. 1 is fixed duration, 2 is until the behavior stops, and 3 is a release contingency where you have a window where you must have none of the problem behavior occurring. So for example, if you send a learner to a timeout procedure or timeout environment, you might let them know you're going to have a fixed duration exit criteria, which means that you're going to be there for 3 minutes, regardless of what you do. You're there for 3 minutes, and after that, you can rejoin the group. You can have an until the behavior stops criterion for exiting the timeout situation, where you tell them, well, if you're calm, you can rejoin the group. So until your behavior stops, you can't come back. But as soon as you're calm and that shouting behavior stops, then you can rejoin the group. And then finally, there's one that's a release contingency, which is basically if you're calm for the last 30 seconds of the timeout procedure, then you may rejoin the group. So if it's a 3-minute procedure, For 2.5 minutes, you can cool down. You can still be a little bit angry. You can still have that problem behavior. But as long as you're calm in those last 30 seconds, then you can rejoin the group. That's a release contingency exit criteria. All right, next, you want to make sure that you follow any legal or ethical compliance guidelines. So timeout must follow guidelines such as informed consent, where people are aware of what the timeout procedure is and how it's going to be implemented. Any behavior intervention plan that you come up with for the timeout procedure, client's right protections. So not all timeouts can be ethical in terms of what the client's rights are. And then also ethical guidelines where you want to use least restrictive methods, such as making the timeout duration as short as possible while maintaining effectiveness and using it in a therapeutic way. So for these types of things, there's many guidelines out there that are available, such as the Behavior Analyst Certification Board Professional and Ethical Compliance Code for Behavior Analysts, the Association for Behavior Analysis International's Position Statement on Restraint and Seclusion. And then if you're doing this in a school environment specifically, there's the Council for Exceptional Children's Policy on Physical Restraint and Seclusion Procedures in School Settings. So make sure that you check with those so that you can maintain legal and, importantly, ethical compliance. Next thing to do to make sure that your timeout is effective is actually make sure that your timeout is effective. That is, you want to evaluate your timeout procedure for effectiveness. So just because you've planned out a great timeout procedure and you're implementing it does not mean that your work is done. During the implementation of the timeout procedure, you want to collect data. You want to collect data on that problem behavior frequency. You want to collect data on the behavior and how much it was occurring before the timeout procedure is implemented, during the timeout procedure, and then after the timeout procedure. You want to document any side effects like aggression and withdrawal, which can result from negative punishment and might just mean that the negative punishment, the timeout procedure is working. And then also you can gather records from other care providers, parents, friends, coworkers, to evaluate how effective the timeout is being. So you want to review, for example, the daily logs of the use of the timeout to evaluate if the reduction in the problem target behavior is actually occurring. If a certain duration of a timeout is effective, can we go lower? Does that lose the effectiveness of it? In which case we can go back up higher and regain that effectiveness. You want to continually evaluate your timeout procedure's effectiveness to make sure that it's actually causing that behavior decrease that we're looking for. And if it's not, you need to modify it somehow to make sure that it can change that behavior and regain that effectiveness. All right, and then finally, the last thing to consider for the effectiveness of your timeout procedure is your plan to end your timeout procedure. So the plan to terminate the timeout procedure needs to be part of that timeout plan. So you don't want to overuse timeout. You don't want to rely on timeout indefinitely. So you do want to have a plan to phase it out. So you do want to have a plan on shifting from this negative punishment timeout procedure to more reinforcement-based strategies by reinforcing, for example, those incompatible behaviors. You want to reduce the timeout duration. You want to basically find a way to get out of that timeout procedure. And basically this means that asking yourself, is the timeout procedure still necessary? Or could a less intrusive method work? So for example, again, if your learner is throwing tantrums, once those tantrums start to decrease as a result of the timeout procedure, you can transition to reinforcing waiting behaviors instead of using the timeout. So instead of punishing the tantrum, you now move to reinforcing the incompatible behavior of waiting periods, hopefully with the effect that the timeout procedure is no longer going to be required. All right, so that was effective ways to use timeout procedures. So today we took a look at the idea that when you're going to use timeout, you don't want to use it as your first behavior modification plan. You want to use it only after other interventions have failed. And then if you want to make sure that it's maximally effective, you need to enrich the time in environment, define the behavior that leads to timeout, choose the appropriate form of timeout, obtain permission and communicate the plan with others, Post and teach timeout rules. Keep timeout duration short and effective. Apply timeout consistently. Establish exit criteria. Ensure legal and ethical compliance. Evaluate your timeout effectiveness and plan to terminate timeout. Woo, that was a lot. But again, all things that you can do to make sure that when you implement a timeout procedure, it is maximally effective and we get that maximum behavior change for the time that we have the learner with us. So that's it for what I wanted to cover today. Next time, we're going to be shifting gears and we're going to look at how people learn by actually watching others. So we're going to explore imitation, we're going to explore modeling, we're going to explore observational learning and how these processes can shape behavior long before a reinforcement or punishment contingency gets implemented. So if you've ever copied somebody without realizing it, then the next video is going to connect a lot of dots as to why. But until then, thank you for joining me. Stay frosty, stay functional. Go modify some behavior. Okay, so today we're going to continue our look at timeout from positive reinforcement, or as it's known more in a short form. Okay, so today we're going to take a... It's happening. Bring it back. Bring it back.